Welcome back. Let's look at the effects of monetary policy on the exchange rate. We're going to start by looking at the case where changes in the money supply are transitory as opposed to permanent. We're going to use our main diagram. The diagram has two quadrants. The horizontal axis is given by dollar returns or the US interest rate. The horizontal axis is the real money balances in the US. And so the bottom quadrant is the US money market, with the equation being the LM equation that relates demand for real balances to the interest rate in the US and the level of real activity in the US. Then on the vertical axis, we're going to have the nominal exchange rate, that is dollars per euro. And the curve that goes in this quadrant, it's UIP, uncovered interest rate parity, which says that the dollar return to a US deposit has to be matched by the dollar return to a European deposit. So we have two quadrants, two vertical axes. The bottom one is inverted, so a decrease in real money balances, actually it's a movement up on this axis, while an increase it's a movement down on this axis. So before we look at changes here, let's pick an initial condition before any change happens. So the way to think about this is that we will go counterclockwise. In the short run, the price level is fixed. We say prices are sticky. So P will not adjust in the short run. That's going to be an important element in this analysis. So the Fed determines how much money it wants to make available to the private sector. And so that's going to pin down M. Together with the sticky price level, that's going to determine real money balances, M over P, on the downward vertical axis. Then we're going to use the LM curve, liquidity money condition, to find the corresponding interest rate in the US. So you want to think of this as the Fed deciding M, and then through the LM condition that pins down the interest rate in the US. Finally, the interest rate in the US through the UIP condition pins down the nominal exchange rate. So we're thinking about going to UIP and then we're going left to the axis. Good. So a couple of things to note. We're going to think of P as being essentially fixed in the short run. That's the sticky prices assumption. We will always keep real US activity fixed unless I tell you anything else about it, like unless we're explicitly looking at a change in US real activity. So Y will always stay in place. On top, in the Forex market, in the currency market, we will keep interest rates in Europe fixed unless I tell you something else about it. And then expectations about the exchange rate in 1 year's time, we're going to keep fixed for now. It's going to be an important element when we look at permanent changes in money supply. But if the change in the money supply is transient, it's temporary, then there is no reason to believe that in 1 year's time the exchange rate would be any different. So those stay in place. Good. So in the short run, if we have transitory or temporary changes in the money supply, we have this counterclockwise determination of the nominal exchange rate through the determination of the interest rate. So the decision of the Fed to set the money supply through the US money market determines interest rates in the US, which in turn through UIP, through the Forex market, determine the nominal exchange rate. Then the question becomes, what happens if the Fed engineers a temporary increase in money supply? So let's see, we're going to have a temporary increase in money supply. Because it's temporary, this is going to be a short-run analysis. So that's very important that I'm going to be explicit about whether this is a temporary or permanent increase in the money supply. So now we're looking at a temporary increase. So in the short run, we said the price level stays fixed. So because of the sticky prices assumption. So then as a consequence, M over P increases when M increases. Of course, because this second vertical axis is downwards, an increase, it's actually a lower level visually on the diagram. So here I'm trying to draw the new M. The new M is lower than the old M, even though it's a bigger number because the axis is inverted, it's going to be lower. So that's going to be potentially a difficult issue. We always have to keep in mind that higher values are actually lower on this axis. Once the Fed increases the money supply, in order for the private sector to be willing to hold the increased quantity of money, of liquidity, interest rates in the US must fall. We said we should think about the LM curve as governing the trade-off the private sector faces between holding interest-bearing assets and money or liquidity. And so if I want people to hold more money, then interest rates have to fall in order for them not to be as much interested in holding interest-bearing assets that pay interest rate R dollar. So a higher money supply leads to a lower interest rate in the US. Then through the UIP condition, we find that this will lead to an increase in the nominal exchange rate. And that means that it takes more dollars to buy 1 euro. The dollar depreciated, that's a weaker dollar. So let's summarize. An increase in the money supply will lower interest rates in the US, which in turn, through UIP, will mean that the dollar appreciates. Sorry, dollar depreciates. It's a weaker dollar. Of course, we can also run this experiment in reverse. If the Fed, for whatever reason, decides to shrink the money supply, that will increase interest rates in the US, and that will strengthen the dollar. The dollar would appreciate under the alternative scenario. So we can always think about these changes in reverse. The important point to note here is that throughout this exercise, we kept expectations about the level of the nominal exchange rate in 1 year's time. We kept that fixed. So this guy we kept fixed. And the reasoning is that if this change in money supply is temporary, maybe you should think about it in terms of days or weeks, then there should be no consequence of this temporary change on the level of the exchange rate in 1 year's time. What we're going to see in our next exercise when we allow for a permanent change in the money supply is that that's no longer going to be the case in that exercise, because then we have to bring in long run considerations, which in turn will mean that we will have to adjust expectations.